Hello everybody, welcome to our virtual 67 Pall Mall. Later on this evening, our last webinar will be with John Gablehausen, who is the owner and winemaker of Rivanna Wines over in Napa Valley. But for now, we're very pleased to welcome back our old friend Demetri Walters, MW, who'll be talking about some of the great white wines of Bordeaux. So please do chat away on the side, share us what you're drinking, where you're drinking it from, and put your photos on social media with hashtag 67FromHome. And a very big welcome to Demetri.
Hello, Ronan.
How are you, Demetri?
I'm fine. I hope there's somebody out there actually watching me.
There's 18 people watching you so far. That's probably because you can only get 18 through the door at once. I'm sure that they are all But it was very nice to see you this week at Decanter.
Yes, Ronan and I were judging at Decanter, and we've just agreed we live in very hot flats, and going to Decanter itself was rather pleasant because the tube was air conditioned on the Jubilee line, and also we're in an ultra modern building that was like a fridge.
It was good.
So it was all good.
You seem to be having fun with the Madeiras as well, I must say.
I'm very lucky. That's why I elected to go on the Port and Madeira panel, amongst other things, because we had 20 gold medals in 2 days. Brilliant. I think that's more than several other categories put together.
Absolutely.
Plus Tony Hadley gets to sing an awful lot.
Yeah, we did get a lot of gold coming out. I mean, I'm a massive fan of dry white Bordeaux, and I think you've got a really interesting selection, some really top quality domains here. So yeah, we're looking forward to what you've got to say.
Good. And welcome all. Glass of wine with you. Starting with Chateau de Montfaucon, Nobody's Perfect. Yum, yum. Whilst I'm doing that, you may have noticed a change of scene. I'm in a different room today. And hopefully my glasses aren't looking as dark as they usually do. I'm going to share a screen with you now and get on with this tasting so you can enjoy your Friday evening. In agreement with Ronan, I'm a big white Bordeaux fan. And the problem I face nowadays is many of the wines I like to drink from Bordeaux that are white have become rather expensive. You may have noticed. Not that I was ever in the market to drink Chateau Haut-Brion Blanc, except at work, which probably happened once or twice a year. It was a real joy though. But they are pretty precious. I know you all know where Bordeaux is, but I thought I'd show you a map, mainly to characterize what Bordeaux is about. Forget colors for a moment, forget dryness or sweetness, red or white. The Bordeaux that the English knew when this was an English crown possession was mainly this. This area here that we now call the Grave is old Bordeaux, if you will, the southern part of the left bank. We call this whole area the left bank, the Gironde estuary in the middle, and then the right bank. This area here, I know you know all this, good to reiterate it, but this is all pretty new. This is a 17th century viticultural innovation. The Dutch were draining the malarial swamp here, which made them very popular with the denizens of Bordeaux city, who suddenly felt a lot better about life, not being killed off by malaria. And they found the gravel beds here were at least the same quality as down here in the Grave, which is why vines started being planted up in a big way, whereas before, any vineyards up here in what later became the Médoc were very much a sort of also ran compared to the rest of the region. This whole area in the medieval period was mostly farmland, grazing land, often inundated, and with a few fortresses like Château d'Isson in Margaux, Château-la-Tour-Canet in the Médoc, and Château-la-Tour, obviously, variously burnt by the British, raised by the French, so on and so forth. So, thus was born the Médoc. Red and white in history. The Grave, red and white. One of the most beautiful parts of Bordeaux, Entre deux Mers, perhaps the most sort of bucolic and villagey part of Bordeaux, both red and white historically. In fact, this whole area up into the right bank of Pomerol, Saint-Emilion, all round the area north of Libourne, was given over to white and red grapes, and still is. We think of Bordeaux as being red wine country, which of course it predominantly is now, but the great majority of the appellations actually have some white grapes as well. So a little background to the region, a little background to the white wines. At 112,000 hectares, Bordeaux is easily France's largest wine producing region, producing 550 million litres a year. That's variously a quarter to a fifth of France's wine production, which is frequently the largest output in the world. And of course, Bordeaux is the largest vineyard area and the largest producing area in France. And just prior to World War II, dry white wine, I should have prefixed white wine with dry white wine, was the majority of Bordeaux production, including sweet wines, easily outproduced red wine. It's hard to believe, isn't it, compared to nowadays? And by the early 50s, dry and sweet wines constituted 50% of total production. This figure didn't change much until the early 70s. And from the 1970s, things began to change. But at that time, the most widely planted grape was Semillon. How things have changed. And today that figure, in terms of white grapes being planted, is nearer 10%, of which dry whites are being produced, or of which grapes produced for dry whites, being grown for dry whites, are about 8% of total production. Very, very small amount. So white wine is produced in almost every one of the 54 appellations of Bordeaux. Excuse me. The most famous white wines come from that area in the south of the left bank, the Grave, classified in 1953, reaffirmed in 59, and all of the 16 Cru Classés from the Grave are in the northern part of the Grave, upheld in 86, and that is Pessac Léognan. 7 red, 3 white, and 6 classified for red and white. These are the main grape varieties. For whites, Semillon is still number one, just at 47% in terms of planting. Sauvignon just behind it at 45, Muscadel 5%, and other grapes. Well, what are those other grapes? Sauvignon Gris, Ugni Blanc, Colombard, Folle Blanche, actually even a little bit of Chardonnay. Let's first go to the Entre deux Mers, where Château de Montfaucon is, and this, the Nobody's Perfect white blend, which has all 3 grapes, is situated just in the northern part of Entre deux Mers, just south of the river, just south of the Dordogne, across from Libourne. And here's my lovely friend, Dawn Jones Cooper, who, as you may know, if you have your hair cut in the West End, is a well-known West End hairdresser for both men and women. And she bought a somewhat tumbled down 17th century property, which is still doing up. She bought that in the vineyards back in 2012, and it's 10 kilometers south of Saint-Emilion. Her first vintage was the following year, 2013. I can't remember how much she produced, but I remember it being a very small amount. 3.5 hectares, that's what she has. Certified organic, but she's biodynamic in practice. So she follows the solar and lunar calendars, and she adheres to these and all the various maxims of biodynamic viticulture in order to achieve what she calls MPH, maximum potency harvesting. So really, harvesting grapes when they have the most to give a wine in terms of flavor compounds, acidity, all the things that count in wine. The interesting thing, as you'll notice a little bit later on in this slide, is her wines very rarely weigh in at more than 12% alcohol. This one's 11.5. So they're known as no hangover wines. Well, if you drank enough, you get them, but you know, you can drink a fair bit and feel pretty rosy. So she's on, as you'd expect, being here in the Entre deux Mers. It's clay, limestone, so argilo-calcaire, but also alluvium and fluvium from when the rivers have have whipped their way over the course of time. She plants cover crops to aid biodiversity, including predatory insects. And this particular blend, this Nobody's Perfect blend, Sauvignon Blanc predominantly, Semillon, and followed up with a few percent, if that, of Muscadel, all hand harvested. Very light pressing, not to extract any bitter tannins. Slow fermentations under temperature control to make sure the estery flavors of the fruit are retained, and followed by lees work for mouthfeel, for that richness you get in wine, and also for an element of what people call minerality, that leesy, yeasty flavor you get from lees contact and lees working, the dead yeast cells effectively. Fermentations in cement and stainless steel, so there's no wood here. And whilst this is an excellent wine, it's not considered typical. Herein lies perhaps a problem with many governing bodies, whether they're Appellation Contrôlée or the DO system in Spain or wherever. If you produce wines in a certain region that are becoming less and less typical, because what is typical anyway? I think maybe history, regulation, and the market can decide that. Well, you might end up producing wine that is better than everybody else's, that's considered untypical, like André Ostertag using a little bit of wood in his wine and having it as a grid reference rather than being able to announce the name of the vineyard. So this is a Vin de France in terms of its appellation. What do you think? Have a go. It's delightfully fruity, isn't it? You get the greenness, that lovely gooseberry and elderflower of the Sauvignon Blanc. There's a certain waxiness and body and expansiveness from the Semillon. And Muscadel just gives a little bit more aromatic lift, a little bit more grapiness and citrusiness. There's no wood here. So there's no distraction for this, what is unashamedly a light wine that has a lot of joy of being, joie de vivre. It's really a lovely wine, and you can drink it and enjoy it, a bit like you would in the Moselle with a Cabernet wine, a low alcohol wine. This is higher in alcohol, but still modest. A wine that shows what white Bordeaux has been doing for centuries. I was lucky enough to inherit a fair amount of white Bordeaux, and it constituted the greater part of a particular cellar that I inherited. And it made me rather sad that what was the norm then had become something rather rarefied, actually. Most of it was the kind of quality you should drink within 10, 15 years, so it was pretty dark brown and undrinkable. What I'm saying is, white Bordeaux has been producing excellent wine for centuries. And we've kind of lost our love for it, which we're getting back, but it's predominantly at the upper level. Isn't it wonderful that someone like Dawn is producing wines that are, well, whilst they're excellently made, they're very good value. And if you're looking for something different, but something that is still a French country wine, this must be it. I'm going out for dinner tonight, so I've got to preload. It's an awful admission, isn't it? So here we are, the left bank again. And we were just in Entre-deux-Mers over here. We're now going down to Sauternes. This is not really an area you associate with dry wines, is it? But let's think, what's happening to the world's sweet wines? Sauternes, Bassac, Port. What's happening to Tokaj and other sweet wine regions that are stellar in terms of the quality of their sweet wines, whether they're red or white? Well, what do you do with all those grapes? You can't only make sweet wine out of them. The world supply of sweet wine has dwindled somewhat because the world demand for it has diminished. So in order to maintain your income, your I suppose your cash flow, why not make excellent dry whites and dry reds? In this case, dry whites from the very grapes that once upon a time would have been made into sweeter wines. Only a slight difference here, because Y, why the Chateau d'Yquem has always been from grapes that weren't actually made into the sweet wine. So this doesn't really need much introduction, does it? If you haven't been and you get the chance to go, do go. It's hallowed ground. It's an ancient estate. It's an estate with medieval origins, and it's associated with the most legendary sweet wine, certainly one of them, probably the most legendary sweet wine on the planet in terms of a single property. If you said to people, what's the most sought after sweet wine, they'd probably say Sauternes and Chateau d'Yquem. They've got 113 hectares of vines, of which 100 are in annual production, creating wines for the estate. Again, calcareous clay, so argilo-calcaire, limestone and clay, and gravel, proceeds of the River Garonne. Since 1959, so it's pretty recent, a dry white wine has also been produced, but not every vintage. And generally in the past, excuse me, very innocent cough, I promise, grapes left over from the harvest of the botrytized grapes, but that didn't have enough botrytis, were made into a dry white wine, which became known as Y or Y, with never more than about 15% botrytis. So those early wines must have been very rich, very complex, super savory, and must have had lots of extract. One of the endowments of having a certain amount of botrytis. Since 2004, Y has been produced every year. And Sauvignon Blanc is harvested at optimal ripeness. That means not overripe, but with all the various flavor precursors in place. And the Semillon is harvested just as botrytis makes its appearance in the vineyards. So you end up with a wine that has great freshness, is clean, doesn't have botrytis. There may be small elements of it in certain vintages. Made with 10 months on lees, on the dead yeast cells, once they precipitate in the barrel post-fermentation. So it's fermented in barrel, a third of which is new. And this particular vintage, 2002, was extremely dry. The third driest vintage in 75 years. That's very, very dry. Warm, but not so light. A bit overcast, a bit like today. Fairly warm and a bit dark. The harvest was a little later than usual, between the 7th and the 9th of October, and 10,000 bottles produced on average each vintage. So this wine is 18 years old and it smells mature. But if you've had a go at it on the palate, it's very fresh indeed. And the more oxygen it gets, the more it opens up. One of those wines made oxidatively and also has spent some time under cork that needs more time in glass or even decanter to wake it up. It's got some of those flavors you associate with the sweet wine. So that flavor profile you get with Sauternes, Barsac, honey, that slightly marmalade-y character you get with Sauternes from the botrytis. We haven't got that, but we've got something similar to it. We've got something very blossomy and honeyed. There's richness here. There's a spiciness here. And yeah, you get something quite peachy and passion fruity. It's on the edge of the tropical spectrum. A little bit pineapple-y as well. It's a very rich, unctuous wine, but completely dry. It has a broad mouthfeel. This is made with a sweet wine head, but from clean grapes. Isn't that interesting? So, a wine that has a legendary sibling is also a legendary wine in its own right, because it's so damn good. This is a celebrated dry white Bordeaux from an area that is increasingly going back to producing dry wine as well as sweet. It makes great commercial sense. It makes great drinking sense too. Hope you like it. You know, in this humid weather, I don't know about you, but I'm being eaten alive. There are mosquitoes and midges. I've got the balcony door open. They're coming in, they're nibbling me under the table. Isn't that pretty? Chateau d'Yquem, rolling downland, much like quite a lot of southern England, although perhaps also with a maritime climate, a warmer maritime climate, slightly nicer maritime climate than ours is on the whole. Let's go north into the left bank proper, into the Médoc, and to one of the northern communes of the Médoc. So north of this map, you'll see Saint-Estèphe, and south, you'll see Saint-Julien, and then there are elements of the Haut-Médoc, and then you go south into Margaux, and then into Forestry, and then into Bordeaux city. So this area was established as a viticultural area back in the late 17th century, around about the 1670s, 1680s. That's when it really became well known for producing wine. The Dutch drained what was a swampy pasture land, sometimes swamp, sometimes dry land, in the 1640s, 1650s. They liked the gravel they found. And where the predominant concentration of vineyards are in the Médoc, and Pauillac is no exception, it has amongst the deepest gravel beds in Bordeaux, you find what are called croup. These are gravel beds. In fact, they're gravel mounds. I wouldn't say a hill, because you don't really notice the inclination, but something that might be a couple of meters or so higher than the surrounding land. And this is where you find, you can see on the map, properties like, if I can find my little blinky, Château Lafite. In fact, Château Lafite has a lot in common with properties across the way in Saint-Estèphe, like Coste d'Estournel, although there's a drainage ditch and a series of drainage ditches separated them. They share a lot of the same terroir, so there is a merging of terroirs between the appellations. If you've been watching Jane Anson's stories, I'm sure she's explained them. But right slap bang in the middle of this particular concentration of properties, you find Chateau Mouton Rothschild, you find Clerc-Millon, you find Pontet-Canet, all very close together. And there's an awful lot of gravel here, something like 20 feet deep, a very deep gravel bed. And in parts of the Barge Plateau down here, so Château-Latour is off the Barge Plateau, but benefits from deep gravel beds. But you find here on the Barge Plateau, very deep gravel beds as well. The story of the white wine of Mouton is very interesting because going back into the mists of time, there were white grapes here. And Philippine de Rothschild, back in the early 80s, decided to plant, or shall I say replant, some white grape varieties. And she planted them high density, 9,000 vines per hectare, a bit like the red grapes. And she planted 53% Sauvignon in ratio, 35% Semillon, and these ratios are pretty much the same today. 11% Sauvignon Gris, which wasn't really singled out in those days as a high quality cultivar of Sauvignon, and also 1% Muscadel for aromatic lift. This is a 4-hectare vineyard on sandy, gravelly soil, very deep soil, overlying limestone. What is the benefit of very deep gravel beds? Well, you have excellent drainage. That can be a problem if the drainage is too good and there's not enough water retention. But underneath you have limestone, which is a sponge, an aquifer, if you will. But also gravel heats up, and sandy gravel will heat up in the sun and retain a lot of heat, which is great for the ripening of certain varieties of grapes. Now, this particular vintage, 14, was a very changeable year with huge contrasts in weather. And throughout most of the vintage, it was pretty metronomed backwards and forwards, but really saved by a long Indian summer. September being a very reliable month in 2014 in terms of being warm, not too hot, but dry. This particular blend is 57% Sauvignon Blanc, 43% Semillon, and that's it. No other grapes. I think that adds up. Quite often with me, these things don't add up, but they do. Harvested fairly early, thanks to the Indian summer, 12th to 18th of September, and fermented separately in lots, different grapes, different plots, different lots, and matured in 50% new oak prior to blending back together. So we go, shall we? So this is a lot more recent, lot younger, a lot less developed than the Y de Chateau d'Yquem, and altogether a bigger wine than that really joyful Nobody's Perfect blend we had at the beginning, but a similar blend. This is doing what many high quality Bordeaux do at about this age, and I was discussing it with Ronan before you came on. It's having a little bit of a sulk right now. In fact, some white Burgundies do this, particularly the top ones. They tend to go into themselves. And we were discussing what the reason for this is. There are many reasons, and I actually think the whole reasoning of this is not yet well understood. But really good white Bordeaux, often with a fair amount of Sauvignon Blanc, once that primary character of Sauvignon in bottle tends to go on in itself and become introspective, Semillon doesn't support in a really fruitful way. And so the wine, if you drink it young, like this, is a little bit waxy, a little bit more Semillon in character than Sauvignon. Of course, Semillon in a warmer climate can actually taste quite Sauvignon-esque in a sunnier climate like Margaret River, for instance. But here, I think we have one grape sulking, one grape that can't actually fill the breach in terms of fruit intensity, but you have a wine that has bags of time left. This is a wine for drinking in youth. This is a wine for drinking when it's much, much more mature. And I think these are wines that can last, well, you've certainly seen with the Chateau d'Yquem, can last a decade and a half or more. I would decant a wine like this to really wake it up. I don't think there's any harm in it. I think they need to be chilled, but not chilled so much that you can't taste what they're about, because they're wines of subtlety. If you want something that's super fruity, this is not for you. If you want something that has a fruit intensity underlaid by a lovely waxiness and a slightly blossomy note from Semillon, certain green textures, then this is for you. And the oak here is very understated. It's judicious. You get a little bit of smokiness, but that's about it. Excuse me. Here's the property. I always think that Mouton is not the most beautiful property, but it produces, when they're good, white and red, amongst the very best that Bordeaux has to offer. On to wine number 4. And here we are, north of Bordeaux city. South of Margaux, there's not much going on, mostly forestry. And to the northwest of Margaux, we have the beginnings of the Haut-Médoc. And then there's a gap, and then you have Saint-Julien. You can just see the sign for Saint-Julien above Sousson. What can I say about Margaux? People say the red wines have the most aromatic intensity. I think there are so few whites, you can't characterize them. But what you can do here on these warm gravel beds, and the property of Margaux, as you can see, is so close to the Gironde estuary that it benefits from this microclimate the Gironde produces, which drives away the coldest extremes of winter and spring when it's a bit dangerous. The vines might get killed by heavy frosting. That's unusual nowadays, but it also can drive away frost damage at bud burst. But also in summer, when you have fairly torrid summers, which they've had in France recently, although it's a bit cooler now, a large body of water like this, particularly moving, can convey that hot air as well. Pavillon Blanc. Now, this is a case in point. I used in Clubland, and these are wines that people have realized are only produced in small quantities, 1,000 cases or so, 12,000 bottles per release. And that's not much at all, is it? When the market is cornered by hungry people like me. So we had a Vin de France, a Bordeaux Blanc Sec. In the past, it was known as Bordeaux Supérieur, but actually a Bordeaux Blanc Sec. The white wines of the Grave and the sweet white wines of Sauternes and Barsac, rather than being sweet, rather than being Sauternes or Barsac, are just known as Bordeaux Blanc Sec. Whereas the white wines of this red classified region are known as Bordeaux Blanc. So here we have a white wine that's been produced at this property since the late 17th century, since the inception of Chateau Margaux. And when formerly, many of the white grapes, I know it's hard to believe, when they went into the red, can you imagine that? Anyway, during the 19th century, the wine was called Vin de Sauvignon du Chateau Margaux. And it was about that time, towards the end of the 18th century and the early 19th century, that they decided to make a white wine. They called it Vin de Sauvignon du Chateau Margaux. Pavillon Blanc was born early, for a named second label, if you will, was named back in 1920. This is from an old 11-hectare plot, which is now given over to this particular wine. And only a third of the harvest is actually bottled. Only a third of the fruit is bottled. The rest is bulked off. So a maximum of 1,000 cases, 100% Sauvignon Blanc, which means you get more sugar than you would if there was Semillon in there. You get more potential alcohol. Let's just say you generally get more alcohol. And you get deep gravel beds, a lot of heat radiating back into the vines, low trellised vines. And 2011, which is this vintage, was warmer than usual in April and May, which is after bud burst, or at bud burst rather, and just before flowering. So it led to an early flowering. But the rest of June, July, and August were cooler, save for the occasional heat spike in the middle of July. Very dry vintage. Dry generally means, if there's not too much stress, it generally means a healthy vintage, because it can put various molds, mildews, down in powdery mildew, and later in the season, botrytis, you can put those into abeyance. But the downside with dry vintages, and there are upsides too, particularly with red grapes, great concentration, smaller berries, better ratio of skin to pulp, nice tannins. But in this particular vintage, white wine yields of 29 hectolitres per hectare. That's 2,900 litres per hectare. That's tiny. You know, they're allowed to produce in the early 40s. Gosh, so much smaller than usual. A very different wine from those that came before. Firstly, it's mature. That doesn't make it different from the previous ones, but it's mature 100% Sauvignon. So you get the green flavor of Sauvignon, but it's not vivid. It is intense. It's very persistent, but you don't get those very ripe Sauvignon flavors that you might get in a sunnier, warmer climate, a consistently sunnier climate. Also, the soils here, compared to much of let's say, Marlborough, New Zealand, are pretty poor. Fairly warm, maritime climate, 100% Sauvignon, a Gallic head. This is not made by Anglo-Saxons. This is very much a wine that is made in the mold of the white wines they've always produced, which are, I think, food wines, deliberately so. And you can't escape the food culture in in the classic old world, like Bordeaux or much of the rest of France or Italy or Spain. So I think this is a Sauvignon by another name. It has some Sauvignon character. It has a little bit of that green gage character, but not so much. A little bit of that elderflower character, but not so much. A little bit appley, a little bit citrusy. But it doesn't have any of that pea shoot flavor you get with a warmer, brighter climate. It's good though, isn't it? Just a different style. This facade was put on during the time of the Emperor Napoleon, but it was refenestrated, re-windowed in about 1804, 1805, something like that. And you can see on the right-hand side, over here, you can see the gravel beds. There's no mistaking what it is. These are coarse gravels. And here we have a slight undulation, which is fairly untypical for the region because it's pretty flat. You stick out like the proverbial on a billiard table in most of the left bank of Bordeaux. But here we have a slight undulation, but very warm gravel beds, which suit these low trellised vines, densely planted, plenty of water underneath. The heat and the moisture combined go to form the wine that you just tasted. Ripe Sauvignon Blanc, ripe in the context of the region anyway. We're now going further south of Bordeaux city, going down into the old Bordeaux, Pessac-Léognan. And isn't it interesting that all the Graves Cru Classés are in the sub-region, albeit it's an independent region, classified back in 1986. They're all in Pessac-Léognan. And Domaine de Chevalier, let me go back again. You can see some of the very famous names here. Fusal, excellent whites and reds. Here's Domaine de Chevalier, right on the edge of the commune. Chateau Aubaye produces wonderful red wines, particularly. And then you go up into Carbonieux. They produce a very vivid white wine style, very fruity, very fruit-giving. Chateau Brown, just coming back into its own after years in relative obscurity. You then have the Ring Road, and that's where you have the family of Haut-Brion. You have the Haut-Brion family of wines, and they are surrounded by properties, at least down here in Domaine de Chevalier, whilst there isn't a major property, it's just a house with a winery attached to it. Here you find, whilst there's no property, there's a single plot of land. It is a domain rather than a chateau. It's a contiguous vineyard, and a continuous vineyard rather, not contiguous with other vineyards, and surrounded by woodland. Whereas up in inside the city limits where Haut-Brion is, and La Ville Haut-Brion, La Mission, you're surrounded by blocks of flats, bungalows, houses, cars, you name it. Bordeaux has expanded, but not down here. 2008 was a lovely white wine vintage, and like 7, 8 was troubled by disease pressure. But like many other disease-pressured vintages, there was perhaps more work, more effort, more or better selection. I find that many pressured vintages, disease-pressured vintages, produce wines that are delicious, delightfully elegant. This is no exception. And whilst 08 is a very good vintage, not as fleshy as 06 or 07, the funny thing is that a difficult red wine vintage is often a favorable white wine vintage in Bordeaux because they require different things. So, Domaine de Chevalier has been in the Bernard family. Olivier Bernard is the current incumbent since 1983. It's a single block, 45 hectares, 5 hectares of which, just 5, although growing slightly, I understand, of which are white. Has a unique microclimate. It's isolated. It's cooled by surrounding forestry, but it's also blessed with warm, dark sand and white gravel soils. I'll show you a photograph after this, enabling slightly earlier harvesting. That's a good thing, isn't it? We still live, even though down here, we're still in Northern Europe, and autumn comes quite early. So the sooner you can get the grapes in ripe, the better. 10,000 vines per hectare, far higher than the communal average of 6,500. Only 18,000 bottles produced of this wine, but slightly more than 10 years ago. There were slightly more vines than 10 years ago, white vines anyway. So 2008, as I was saying before, was wet and overcast at spring, leading to late and fairly uneven flowering. Drier and brighter in July, with a fairly moderate August, nothing to write home about, nothing exceptional. In late September and early October, the harvest took place. So a fairly long harvest, not particularly late, a fairly normal time for a white harvest here. 85% Sauvignon Blanc, 15% Semillon. That's relatively normal. And a good vintage, not as fleshy as 6, I think, just as characterful as 7, perhaps not as grand as 7 in many respects, but fruity and classified for white and red wines. This particular property, a rising star, and a wine that I buy as often as I can, as often as I can. It's become quite expensive, and the reds have definitely come up. Very age-worthy. This particular wine is going through, again, a little bit of a sulk. On the nose, those of you who have it in front of you, it's quite oxidative, almost saline, slightly sherried. I was talking to Ronan earlier, and this reminds me, in a way, of Dominique Laffond's wonderful Merceau Chardonnay. They go through a bit of a sulk as well, and they become quite oxidative and sherried. And this is an oxidatively made wine in terms of its barrel aging and time under cork, but they snap back into shape. I would say at 12 years old, this wine still isn't drinking at best, and I would be tempted just to leave it alone. I've opened a number of bottles in the past, and I hasten to add, not my own sadly, but when I worked at Berry Brothers and Rudge, of Chateau Haut-Brion Blanc, which used to go through a very similar sort of rather mute and slightly sherried phase. Wines like this, I think, at this age, in fact, almost at any age, need the elegance of a decanter, and it really opens the wines up. There's an interesting interplay between oxidatively made wines and when they're opened and need further oxygen to wake up. It's almost limey. It has a saline twist to it, and a lime twist. It's underlaid by really great acidity. It's quite green. There's a strong Sauvignon character here. And it still has that waxy base of Semillon. It hasn't developed its honeyed flavors yet, but a vintage you can continue to enjoy for years to come, depending upon how you like to drink these wines. Personally, I like them throughout the development, and the important thing is to keep on trying them. Because if you buy one bottle of this, what a shame. You might drink it too soon or too late. If you buy 2, same problem. 6, that's getting better, but what happens if you want to have a party with these wines? Buy a case. I would say this, wouldn't I? Buy a case and experiment. Maybe one of the bottles you'll be drinking too young. Might be vibrantly fruity, but a little bit monocultural in its flavor profile. You can then try them at sort of judicious intervals and see how you like them and see how the wine is developing. And that is how you get to understand the wine that you like and that you buy and that you sell. Cheers. One of my favorite properties. And incidentally, I've tried that wine at 30 years and it's been just delicious. So here is a photograph of the property with the forestry in the background. This is the winery, most of it's winery. And here is a number, or you can see 2 blocks of vines within the domain of 45 hectares, only 5 hectares being white, and that's mostly Sauvignon. And they're biodynamic in practice and principle, if not certified yet, I believe. Here's a horse. So the work in the vineyards is mostly done by horses. Horses exert much less pressure, much less possibility of compaction of the soils. Remember, compacting soils means inhibited drainage, inhibited oxygen ingress, and the upper soils are full of microbes that need oxygen. There's less compaction as well, which also affects the substrate. Horses, well, what comes out of their rear ends is fine if you rot it down, because they're not ruminants. If they eat something with seeds in it, like a tomato or whatever, it'll come out the back end completely intact. You'll have weeds everywhere. So whatever weeds they eat going in will come out the back almost fully intact. So you don't have horses for their manure necessarily, unless it's very well rotted, usually by mushrooms. You have them for their muscular power, their lack of compaction of the vineyards, and because if you're slowing down what you do in terms of your mind, and you're looking at nature, there's no horse much better than a tractor, let's face it. Very expensive though. Look at the soils. We have clay, we have sand, we have quartzite, we have river stones. This looks like a river, doesn't it? Well, of course it was once. And gosh, that's pretty fuzzy. Don't adjust your eyeballs. This is me skimping on photographic space. So here we have, finally, another Pessac wine, but where actually with this one, we're inside the city limits. We were just down here a moment ago, Domaine de Chevalier, sorry, just down here, Domaine de Chevalier, and we were outside the Bordeaux Ring Road. We're now inside the Bordeaux Ring Road at Château-la-Ville-Aubryon, right next to Château-la-Mission-Aubryon and a spit from Château-Aubryon. Same vintage, nice to compare and contrast. Formerly owned by the Waltner family. And they're originally bottled in the 20s and 30s as Château-la-Mission-Aubryon Blanc. In 1983, it was bought by the Dion family, or Dillon family, an American industrialist. Anyway, an American with the money to buy a distressed vineyard. And back in the 20s, when the Dillons bought Château-Aubryon, this wasn't for sale. 2010 was the announcement that from the 2009 vintage, the name would revert to Château-la-Mission-Aubryon Blanc. We think of Château-la-Mission-Aubryon as being a red wine. It is. Welcome then, from 2009 onwards, but announced in 2010, that this wine would be called Château-la-Mission-Aubryon Blanc. So 2008, this wine is the last La Ville Aubryon, the vineyard right next to it. And this 3.5 hectare Clos la Ville, the little walled vineyard, at least most of it once was, on quaternary gravels. That is gravels from ice ages going back something like 2.5 million years. Ronan is the geologist here. I'm sure he'll know the answer. But quaternary gravels, quartz, sand, shells, courtesy of many ice ages, which have caused the river, the Garonne, to move, to change its course. 75% Sauvignon Blanc, 25% Semillon. The last wine was 85 and 50. You notice how they're all producing around about 1,000 cases. It's not much at all, is it? Wish they'd produce more. So 1,000 cases of this, and managed by 2 generations of a closely associated family. You can't say Aubryon, La Mission, or La Ville, now La Mission Aubryon, without saying the Dillon family, who started buying up properties after the First War, where there was a lot of distress in the Bordeaux wine trade. You can't mention their names and their holdings without mentioning the Delmas, Jean Bernard and his son Jean-Philippe. And the whole group now is chaired by with founder Clarence Dillon's great-grandson, Prince Robert of Luxembourg, or as he's affectionately known in the trade over here, Bob Deluxe. What do you think of that? This is a rare treat, and those of you who haven't had this before, I hope you realize why it's a treat. The story, the return to form, the return to what it originally was. But this is the last vintage of what it was in between, a different name, Château-la-Ville-Aubryon, one of the great white names in Bordeaux, Bordeaux Blanc history. Again, a wine just going through a little bit of a sulk now, but has this lovely richness, this honeyed texture, slightly honeyed flavors, but still something green and sappy about it. Very refreshing, broad and expansive, without being ponderous and heavy. Lovely, isn't it? A wine for the cellar. I wouldn't drink this, or now I'm being attacked by a blue bottle. I wouldn't drink this or the last wine quite yet. And if I was going to, I would definitely decant them and not drink them from bottle at this particular stage of their evolution. I think we've done pretty well for time, haven't we? Ronan. I think we're there.
How are you? I'm here. Yeah, how are you? Very nice.
I'm very well. Were you having a nap?
I wasn't. I was in the other room, but I did hear you shouting, requesting me. Just for a moment.
Let me read them out. Here's Ming, who I know quite well now. What happens to the 2/3 of the fruit that wasn't bottled? It's generally bulked off, either as fruit or as wine. In this case, as fruit, I believe. So I hope that answers your question. Obviously, only 1/3 of the vineyard is in any particular vintage of the quality that they really want. Any thoughts on the frequency of premature oxidation during the past decade in dry white Bordeaux? That's a very good question. And I don't think, that's not something I feel equipped to answer without some evidence. But Mark Carrington, let me give you some anecdotal opinion here. I don't think Premox is a problem in Bordeaux. I think it's a problem that has been in Burgundy. So those last two wines, in my view, are not Premoxed. They are just the sulk that is very smart white Bordeaux. I hope that answers your question. I haven't measured it, but I haven't noticed it. And I drink white Bordeaux an awful lot, particularly mature white Bordeaux. Of course, you said in the last 10 years. Well, I would say that we'll have to wait and see because sometimes Premox shows of itself when you're least expecting it. Alistair, is there a limit to the age-worthiness of these top whites from Bordeaux? There's always a limit to age-worthiness, but I would say drinking from whenever you want to drink them up to 30, 40 years, depending on the vintage, the property, and the quality of the actual wine being produced. If it's their top label, top white label of Margaux is Pavillon. La Ville, I think, now as Château-la-Mission-Aubryon Blanc, gosh, 30 years or more. It depends how you like to drink them. I like these wines with a certain oxidative weave about them, you know, when they become rather almondy and nutty. So it depends how you like them. Depends on the vintage, depends on the property and the particular cuvée in question, but there's no reason. I mean, I've drunk Domaine de Chevalier at 30 years. It's been really on song. You have to give them a chance to erupt from the glass aromatically. Ronan.
Yes, thank you.
View on that? I haven't finished yet. Have you got any view on that in terms of white Bordeaux? I said top whites, 30 years plus.
Oh yeah, I think so. And probably
they need to wake up.
Yeah, and the Premox thing is that I think Burgundy's been making great white wines for a long time, so you probably notice old Premox Burgundies. Probably Bordeaux, unless it's the top chateau, hasn't been making great white wine for quite as long, I would say. I remember there was a lot of very, very average white Bordeaux for a long, long time. So you wouldn't have even noticed if it was premium.
It wasn't Premots though, it was just bad.
Yeah, just bad.
Yeah. But the good properties, like Demetri Chevalier, whilst they're better than they've ever been, have been good for a long time. Aubryon Blanc, La Ville Aubryon, what else? Even a more, in terms of price, humble wine like Carbonnier, they last a long time. Their fruit definition changes, but the age worthiness is something that they just go on and on and on. And I've tasted white Bordeaux from the 80s and been surprised how fresh they are. Hope that answers your question. Miriam Reynolds, why are the plantings at Demetri Chevalier 10,000 versus 6,500? I imagine they're probably 10,000 elsewhere, but the average is 6,500 because they want to have a stressing of the vines. If you get the vine spacing wrong, you can actually make the vine very uncomfortable indeed. You can stress it too much. Too few nutrients being drawn up by the roots, too little moisture, perhaps row shading, fruit shading. In the case of very wide plantings, if they're inappropriately wide, well, you end up with very large canopies, a dirty great triffid, and you don't stress the vine enough. So, as in your garden, you know, plants are happy when you treat them a little bit harshly, but you go too far, they stop trying to please you. So the plantings at Demetri Chevalier were deliberately planted at that concentration in order to find the maximum repayment of fruit precursors, pH, acidity, concentration, but also wind back in order to give the vines what they need. Do you see global warming? This is Julian Kirk. Do you see global warming affecting the style and grape mix of white Bordeaux, and in what way? Yeah, good question. They're all good questions. Global warming is just part of climate change. Climate change is the big thing. Global warming is something that is affecting most people in one way or another. Let me rewind a little bit. If you're in England, global warming is a good thing because you can appreciate a better climate over a very slow period of time. I'm talking about vineyards here. If you're in somewhere that is marginal, hot, like Lebanon, Turkey, Cyprus, parts of Napa Valley, Montalcino, it's not so good. So in Bordeaux, sure, it's changing the style. What has been somewhat obscured, though, is how has that style changed? Is it just down to global warming? I think not. A lot of it's down to better viticulture. I think that's the main story. Better selection of the grapes. Trying to get really good points. Do you remember the days of people obviously trying to get really good Parker points or other pundit points? So I think global warming, climate change, is part of the story. The most visible problem with climate change have been mega weather events, huge hailstorms, and very heavy rainstorms when you're least expecting them. Rain is damaging. Rot can set in if it happens at the wrong time. It can ruin flowering. It can encourage mildew and botrytis. But also, hail can be devastating. Hail can actually wipe out that vintage and damage the next vintage. I hope that answers your question as well. So do I see global warming affecting the style and grape mix of white Bordeaux? The jury's out, but yes, I do. For the reasons I've outlined historically, who knows what the changes are being caused by, partly by climate, partly by the market, partly by, and that includes Parker points, etc., partly by we want everything now, so wines are being made to be more easily drinkable at an earlier age, but also viticulture and selection are better. So see climate change and global warming as just part of the equation, and I think that's the answer. Would you recommend? Hello, Jachen. How are you? How's life in Miami? would you recommend some producers from the rest of the world that make high quality wines of white Bordeaux style? I don't think there are any, actually. Not quite the same, but in terms of blends, I think you can look at Margaret River. In terms of excellent Sauvignon, I think New Zealand is stepping away from that very vivid style that you may remember, particularly from Marlborough. I think the most enduring style of Sauvignon in people's minds must come from the central vineyards of France in the Loire Valley, places like Puy and Puy-Fumé, Rueil, Quincy, Menetou-Salon, Sancerre. But in terms of producers, I don't think there's anybody who produces white Bordeaux style Sauvignon Semillon blends, or indeed 100% Sauvignon. They don't taste like anything else because of that confluence of, well, I think, the winemaker, the viticulturalist's mind, the climate, the macro-meso-microclimate, the physical element of terroir, but also, the history of this place has made wines that when they're harnessed with nature, when they're associated with what they have, produce something that's very different. So I'm going to cop out and say, no, there isn't anything quite like white Bordeaux. Not just because I love white Bordeaux, dry white Bordeaux, but because there isn't anything so similar. Ronan, do you think there's anything similar?
I don't know, not really, not on the same scale. I mean, Friuli maybe is doing some good barrel-aged Sauvignons, Miani, people like that. And then
Miani are very good. Alvaro Pecorare.
The odd people like Altaina de Brassica from Gaia, which is a similar style.
Yeah.
Peter Michael, the L'Après-Midi. So, but not really regions doing quite as.
No, they have different acidity.
Yeah.
They have different, what I like about white Bordeaux is these are wines that use wood to get to where they want to be, but the wines are not woody. And these wines are so varied in character. I'm going to plug my friend Dawn Jones Cooper here. If you want a wine that is way above every day, that you can drink every day, you do well to look at her wines. She does varietal Bordeaux varieties, but also in her Nobody's Perfect range, she also does the blend. I like the blend very much, but her varietal Sauvignon and Muscadel are excellent too. Chen, you know where to find me if you want to probe me further about this. Anyway, all, I hope you enjoyed this evening, and I won't see you again for about 3 weeks, I think, maybe a bit longer. So until we meet again, Ronan, I'll probably bump into you at some point, but until we meet again, the rest of you, cheers. And thank you for tuning in. Thanks for listening. And thank you for asking questions. And if you want to ask me more questions, you can just email me. Get in touch with me. Cheers.